On a blistering Lagos afternoon, the kind that turns your shirt into a second skin, a skinny teenage girl lay on a raffia mat in a cramped room behind a tailor's shop. Her eyes were open, but empty. The corners of her lips were cracked. A string of dried saliva glued itself to her chin. Flies landed. Unbothered by the women fanning her with cardboard, by the sharp smell of sweat, kerosene, and stale palm oil drifting in from the street. Outside, people argued about what she was. A saint? A fraud? A girl cursed by witches? A curious policeman pushed through the crowd and wrinkled his nose at the odor, at the sight of a body that refused to behave like a body. "She hasn't eaten," someone whispered, half in awe, half in disgust. "She hasn't spoken in days." And then, here's the part no one forgets, she suddenly smiled. Not a weak, polite smile. A smile like someone who just returned from a place you cannot point to on any map, and brought a message back. Her name was Christiana Abiodun Emmanuel. In the 20th century, in a Nigeria still squeezed between old gods and new empires, she became a folk prophetess people loved, feared, and fought over. The question isn't only what she saw. The question is why so many Nigerians, especially Yoruba communities, still treat her name like a match to dry grass, a single spark, and an entire history catches fire. Now rewind. Before the trance, before the white robes, before rivals tried to erase her fingerprints from the story, there was just a girl and a country that was changing faster than anyone could pray about. She entered the world at the edge of borders. Political borders, spiritual borders, family borders. Some accounts place her birth in Abeokuta, a proud Yoruba city of red earth and rocky outcrops. Others trace her earliest beginnings. Across the frontier in Porto Novo, in what is now the Republic of Benin. Either way, her bloodline carried movement inside it. A father tied to Abeokuta, a mother from the coastal world of Porto Novo, where languages mixed like market spices and where every family story seemed to end with somebody leaving or returning changed. Her childhood smelled of damp wood after rain, of soap made in blackened pots, of church hymn books handled by many hands. Christianity had already entered Yoruba lands, but it didn't arrive like a gentle visitor. It arrived like a new rhythm that competed with old drums. In the same compounds where elders could still whisper the names of Orisa with reverence, young people learned Bible verses in schools. Run by mission teachers who spoke of salvation with the certainty of men holding rulers and timetables. Christiana grew up hearing both kinds of certainty. In the mornings, she could hear prayers in English, careful, disciplined, almost military. In the evenings, she could hear the softer, older kind of spiritual talk. Warnings about jealousy, about unseen forces, about the way a neighbor's smile could hide a knife. A child learns early what adults pretend is complicated, that the world has visible rules and invisible rules, and both can punish you. What set her apart wasn't that she believed in spirits. Everyone did in one form or another. What set her apart was her stubborn appetite for meaning. She wasn't satisfied with, because that's how it is. She wanted the reason behind the reason. She watched adults perform rituals, Christian and traditional, and noticed something that would later become her gift and her curse. People needed answers more than they needed comfort. They needed to believe their suffering had a storyline. And even as a girl, Christiana had a storyteller's mind. There are people who remember her as quiet, observant, reserved, always listening. But quiet is not the same as small. Quiet can be a kind of pressure building behind a closed door. When she stared, it wasn't the empty stare of daydreaming. It was the stare of someone counting details. The way a pastor's voice rose when he wanted money. The way a mother's voice softened when she spoke of a missing child. The way fear changed the shape of a room. When she was old enough to be useful, life made a decision for her the way life does for most girls. Learn a trade, sewing, needle and thread, a respectable skill, a skill that could feed you even when the world turned cruel. So she trained, first in the slower rhythm of smaller towns, then in the feverish pace of Lagos, the colonial city that pulled people in like a tide. Around 1920, still barely more than a child, she left home and joined her aunt in Lagos to learn tailoring. Imagine what that move meant. Lagos was not a village where everyone knew your grandmother's name. Lagos was noise, metal, shouting, traffic, barges, the stink of the lagoon, and the constant grinding feeling that the future was, elbowing its way into the present. In Lagos, Christiana learned to live inside contradictions. On one street, you could see the polished shoes of colonial clerks and the crisp uniforms of British officers, men who spoke as if the city belonged to their paperwork. On the next street, you could see barefoot children running past traders selling peppers, smoked fish, cola nuts, and charms wrapped in cloth. Churches stood near shrines. Hymns floated over drums. The air carried both incense and engine smoke. It was in Lagos that Christiana's eyes sharpened. Tailoring taught her patience, but it also taught her something more dangerous: how to read bodies. A seamstress learns where people carry weight, where fabric pulls because someone is anxious, where a blouse is pinned tighter because a woman wants to look powerful today. You touch cloth, but you learn about pride and shame, and Lagos, with all its hunger, taught her about status. People were becoming modern. People were becoming Christian. People were becoming colonial subjects with baptism certificates and school reports. But people were also still afraid, still jealous, still desperate for protection when sickness came, when money disappeared, when a child's fever wouldn't break. Christiana watched that desperation flow toward anyone who claimed spiritual authority. That's important, because this is where the seed of the coming war was planted, long before anyone called it a war. In every bustling city, there are spiritual entrepreneurs. Some are sincere, some are predators, some are both. They gather crowds, they promise healings, they collect offerings, and they build reputations that can outlive them. In early 20th century Yoruba Christianity, a new kind of spiritual figure was rising: the prophet healer, someone who didn't just preach doctrine, but battled the invisible world on your behalf. As a teenage girl in a tailor's shop, Christiana saw men walk in and out of that role like kings trying on crowns. Some of them spoke against paganism with dramatic anger, then quietly accepted money from the very families whose traditions they condemned. Some of them treated women as useful choir voices, beautiful, disposable, replaceable. Christiana noticed this too. She kept it in her chest like a stone. You might think a young seamstress would stay out of all that. Keep her head down. Stitch, earn, survive. But something in her refused the smallness assigned to her. She was religious, yes, raised within church life, but she wasn't the type to be satisfied with borrowed faith. She wanted to feel God the way people described feeling Harmattan wind: undeniable, bodily, impossible to argue with. The sermons she heard weren't enough. The mission-style Christianity around her sometimes felt like a closed room with a ceiling too low. Neat rules, clean hymns, polite prayers. But her city was not neat. Her people were not polite in their suffering. Their pain was loud, messy, and sometimes embarrassing, like a wound that refuses to stay covered. So her heart began to lean toward the kind of spirituality that met people where they actually lived. In the evenings, after the last customer left, she would hear talk, half gossip, half warning, about prayer groups that stayed up late, and about people who prayed until they shook, about healings that happened without medicine, about voices that spoke in trance. These were the early currents of what would later be known as Aladura, the praying people, a movement that didn't ask Africans to leave their spiritual instincts at the church door, but redirected them with Christian language: visions, angels, holy war, deliverance. To a young woman trying to breathe inside a world of control, colonial control, patriarchal control, social control, this kind of faith could feel like oxygen. But oxygen can also feed a fire. One detail about Christiana's youth gets overlooked because it sounds too ordinary. She was ambitious, not the loud ambition of men who already believed the world belonged to them. The quiet ambition of someone who knows the world will not offer her a seat unless she builds her own chair. She watched how women were praised for obedience and blamed for disasters. She watched how young girls were told their holiness was in silence. And she internalized a dangerous thought. What if silence is exactly what keeps the world the way it is? Still, she did not yet know what shape her life would take. She wasn't planning a church. She wasn't plotting a movement. She was simply living in a place where spiritual events could feel as real as rain. And then came the procession. Every year, Catholics in Lagos marked Corpus Christi with public ceremony, white cloths, incense, banners, a kind of holy theater that drew crowds even from outside their denomination. For Christiana, it was strange and magnetic. She was not Catholic. She came from a different strand of Christianity. But the human hunger behind rituals is universal. The sense that if you do the right thing in the right order, heaven might notice you. On that day, she went to watch. Picture it. A young Yoruba girl squeezed among bodies, the sun pressing down, the air thick with dust and perfume, people pushing for a better view. A priest held a sacred object high. Candles trembled in the breeze. The crowd's breath rose and fell like one creature. Christiana's skin prickled, not from romance, from warning. She felt something in the ceremony aimed straight at the place inside her that refused to be ordinary. Something about the discipline of the procession, the certainty, the pageantry, clashed with the chaos she carried in her private thoughts. It wasn't just beautiful, it was provocative. It asked a question without words. Do you believe enough to let your body prove it? Her throat tightened. She tried to step back, to leave, to return to her normal life of cloth and thread. But her feet didn't obey the way they usually did. Her vision narrowed. The sounds of the street, vendors, carts, distant waves began to distort, as if someone was slowly turning a knob on reality. The last thing she clearly registered was the taste of smoke and incense mixing in the back of her mouth, making her slightly nauseous, like swallowing someone else's prayer. Then her knees softened, and Lagos, busy Lagos, devoured by its own noise, gained one more scandal to gossip about. A teenage girl collapsing in public, her body taking on a stillness that looked too much like death and too much like theater. They carried her away. Someone said she was bewitched. Someone said she was pretending. Someone said she had seen an angel. Someone, already hungry for a headline, said, "This is the beginning of something." Inside that small room behind the tailor's shop, the days began to stack up. The mat grew damp with the city's humidity. The air grew foul. The watchers grew tired. And the rumor grew legs, sprinting through Lagos faster than any official messenger. A girl was lying motionless. A girl was refusing food. A girl was smiling in her sleep. And sooner than anyone expected, someone would decide they had to control the story, or be controlled by it. Because when a spiritual event happens in a crowded city, it never stays private. It becomes a battlefield. And the first people to arrive on the battlefield are not saints. They are claimants. They come with prayers on their lips and competition in their eyes. When Christiana finally moved again, it didn't look like a miracle at first. It looked like a problem. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched as if she was trying to grab something invisible in the air. A woman leaned close, expecting words, expecting a confession, a prayer, something. And what came out of Christiana's mouth was not a neat sentence. It was a rasping sound, like someone dragging a chair across a cement floor. The room went quiet in that special way. Crowds go quiet when they're afraid the wrong noise will break the spell. Then she spoke. Not about herself. Not, "Where am I?" Not, "I'm hungry." Not, "Please help." Her first words, according to those who swore they were there, were a warning, sharp enough to cut skin. "Stop touching what isn't yours." A woman's hand, still hovering over the girl's forehead, jerked back as if slapped. Christiana sat up slowly, eyes too clear. The kind of clear that makes you uncomfortable because it feels like she can see the private part of you. Someone offered her water. She stared at the cup like it was a trick. Then she tipped it to her lips, took one swallow, and pushed it away. A neighbor whispered, "She's not normal." A man muttered, Or she's acting... And in the middle of that split, fear on one side, suspicion on the other, Christiana did the single most dangerous thing a mystery girl can do in a city full of opportunists. She became useful, because within hours, people started dragging their problems into that cramped room like sacks of dirty laundry. A woman, eyes swollen from crying, begged for news of a missing child. A trader hissed about money that kept disappearing as if it was being eaten by an unseen mouth. A young man insisted he'd been waking up with scratches on his back, 3 lines at a time, like someone was signing their name on him while he slept. Christiana listened, motionless, head tilted slightly, like a bird deciding whether you're food. And then she began to speak in a way that made the room feel smaller. Not sermons, not church language. More like verdicts. She told the crying mother not to curse anyone yet, because the child, she said, was alive, but hidden by confusion. She told the trader to check his own house before accusing witches. She told the scratched young man to stop sleeping with his head under a mirror and to burn the cloth tied under his bed. People looked at each other. Mirrors, cloth, hidden things. This wasn't the polished Christianity of school hymns. This was Christianity with its sleeves rolled up, stepping into the same messy spiritual alleyways people had always lived in. Only, now it spoke the name of Jesus while doing it. And that was exactly what frightened the established churches. Because in Lagos, the moment a girl starts solving problems, she stops being a person and becomes a symbol, a battlefield flag, a prize. It didn't take long for the whispering to reach people who made a living from whispers. A certain kind of man always shows up when a prophetic gift appears. The handler, the manager, the one who claims to understand, the power and promises to guide it. Sometimes he's sincere. Sometimes he's a parasite. Sometimes he can't tell the difference. In Christiana's story, the man who stepped into frame was already known for his spiritual intensity. Moses Orimolade, a prophetic figure whose name carried weight among the prayer-minded, a man people described in the same breath as fasting, visions, and spiritual warfare. And when he heard about the girl, about the trance, the smile, the warnings, he did not treat it like gossip. He treated it like a summons. Imagine the moment he entered the room. He didn't come like a curious neighbor. He came like someone walking into a storm he expects to control. His eyes reportedly scanned Christiana the way a soldier scans terrain, looking for the hidden danger, the hidden advantage. Christiana didn't bow. She didn't perform. She didn't rush to honor him the way young women were trained to honor older men. She just looked back. 2 currents met in that room, 2 kinds of authority, and for a brief moment, it looked like they might fuse into something unstoppable, because here was the perfect pairing. Orimolade, the older prophet with reputation, structure, and followers, and Christiana, the young prophetess with raw fire, the one who had just walked out of a trance like someone returning from the dead. People love a spiritual duet. It feels balanced, safe. It tells the crowd, this is not chaos. This is destiny. They began praying together, leading others in all-night vigils that turned simple rooms into furnaces. People sang until their voices broke. They clapped until their palms stung. They wept until they ran out of tears. They called down heaven like they were banging on a locked gate. And the thing is, results followed. You can argue theology all day, but ordinary people don't join movements because they read the fine print. They join because something happens that their neighbors can't explain away. There were healings people swore were real, strange coincidences, predictions that landed too close to truth to dismiss comfortably, words spoken in prayer that hit the exact nerve someone tried to hide. Once a man came to test them, smiling, arms folded, pretending he just wanted to watch. Christiana stared at him and said softly, "You came with a knife in your pocket. You want to cut what you can't own." The man's smile dropped. He reached into his pocket without thinking. And there it was, a small blade. The room erupted. Some people shouted, triumphant, "Caught!" Some looked sick, because now they had to accept the obvious. Whether Christiana was holy or dangerous, she was not ordinary. The movement swelled. And when a movement swells, it attracts more than believers. It attracts rivals. At first, the rival didn't announce himself with a big entrance. He arrived like mold, quietly, in the corners, thriving in damp places nobody wanted to inspect. He was not one person at first, but a type. Church elders who feared losing control, prayer leaders who feared being overshadowed, and spiritual entrepreneurs who saw a girl becoming famous and thought, why not me? Then, as the group tried to form itself into something more defined, something that could outlive a single night of prayer, the rivalry sharpened into a clearer conflict. Who exactly was leading this fire? Orimolade had seniority, reputation, and a loyal base. To many, that was leadership. But Christiana had the thing crowds secretly value more than seniority. She had the moment. She was the one who collapsed, the one who returned, the one whose story people could repeat in marketplaces like a legend. She was the proof something supernatural had chosen their time, their city. And for some men, that was unbearable. Because a woman with spiritual authority breaks more than tradition. She breaks the invisible economy of respect. If she can speak and be believed, then what else can women do? What else have women been prevented from doing not by God, but by fear? So, the attacks began. Not directly at first. Indirectly. Like poison slipped into food. They said she was possessed, not anointed. They said she was mentally unstable. They said Orimolade was being deceived by a young girl playing tricks. They said she used charms. They said she was using the name of Jesus to smuggle in pagan power. The cruelest rumor was the one that leaned on disgust, because disgust is a shortcut to control. They whispered that her trance wasn't holy, that it was a kind of spiritual filth, that when she lay rigid and unblinking, she was sleeping with spirits, that her body had been used by something unclean. People repeated it with relish, because even in religious communities, there are always those who enjoy tearing down a woman more than they enjoy building up God. Christiana heard it, and instead of shrinking, she did something that made her enemies hate her more. She started setting boundaries. She insisted on discipline within the prayer band, rules about fasting, about sexual conduct, about behavior during vigils. Some loved that, because structure makes spiritual experiences feel safer. Others resented it, because structure is also power. And around this time, the group took on the identity that would become famous. White garments, the emphasis on purity, the imagery of angels and heavenly hosts, cherubim and seraphim. White cloth wasn't just fashion. It was a statement. It declared, we are a different kind of people now. It also made them impossible to ignore. When a band of worshippers in white moves through a dusty street, they look like living ghosts. And that's where the second twist hit. The very symbol that drew people in, purity, white garments, angelic identity, also made them a target. Because if you claim purity in public, every enemy becomes an investigator. A rival prayer leader began following their gatherings, trying to catch anything he could present as hypocrisy. He wasn't even subtle. He'd linger near doorways, pretending to be casual, eyes narrowed, listening for errors. Sometimes he'd bring others, and they'd murmur together like rats behind sacks of grain. One night, during a packed vigil, the air so thick with sweat and perfume it felt chewable, he stood up suddenly and shouted, "This girl is the real altar. She's the one you worship." The room jolted. People gasped. Some hissed at him to shut up. Others froze, because the accusation, even if false, touched a fear they didn't want to name, that they were replacing God with celebrity. Orimolade rose, furious. He called the rival a disruptor. The rival shouted back that Orimolade was hiding behind a girl's visions. Insults flew like stones. In the chaos, someone pushed someone else. A lamp tipped. Hot oil spilled across the floor, and for a second it looked like the whole place might catch fire. Christiana didn't scream. She walked forward into the middle of it, barefoot, stepping past the spreading slick of oil like it was nothing, and said one sentence. that sliced through the room. You want a throne? Silence. Real silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. Her gaze locked on the rival. You want a throne, and you think if you smear me with dirt, you'll look clean. The rival tried to laugh. And you think you're clean? Christiana leaned slightly closer, voice low enough to feel intimate and threatening at the same time. You brought your charms into the prayer house. You tied them inside your belt. You believe in Jesus with your mouth, and you fear other powers with your skin. The rival's face changed. Not outrage, not indignation. Panic. He reached instinctively toward his waist, and the room saw it. A bulge under cloth. A knot. Something tied tight. People surged forward. Hands grabbed. Cloth tore. A small bundle fell, wrapped in dirty fabric, smelling faintly of herbs and old sweat. The disgust hit like a wave. Even those who believed in spiritual warfare recoiled at the physical evidence. Something secret, something hidden, something carried close to the body. In that moment, the rival lost the crowd. Not because everyone suddenly became rational, but because crowds hate being fooled. He fled, shoved out into the street, his dignity torn like the cloth that had hidden his bundle. That night became a legend retold in different forms. The night a woman prophetess exposed a competitor who pretended to be pure. And this is the brutal truth. That victory didn't calm things down. It escalated them. Because humiliation creates enemies who don't just want to win, they want to erase you. After that night, the threats became less polite. A few members of the prayer band were attacked on their way home. Someone threw stones at a house where they met. Children mocked them in the street, calling them names that mixed religion with sexual insult, the easiest way to poison a woman's reputation. Christiana began sleeping less. People around her noticed she was thinner, her cheekbones sharper, her eyes always awake even when her body rested. The gift that made her famous was now eating her from the inside. And Oramalade, whatever his intentions at first, began to understand something that frightened him too. He could not fully control this. When Christiana spoke in prophecy, it didn't always flatter leaders. Sometimes it corrected them, sometimes it rebuked them. Sometimes it pointed to uncomfortable truth inside the group itself, jealousies, secret sins, greed hiding behind piety. That is the moment when partnership starts to crack. Because many leaders can handle a prophetess as long as she's useful. Few can handle her when she's independent. So tensions rose, subtle, then sharper. Whispers that Oramalade was the true founder, and Christiana was merely a vessel. Whispers that Christiana was the true chosen one, and Oramalade was only a gatekeeper. Whispers that one should step back, the other should step aside. And Christiana felt the trap closing. If she submitted too much, she would become a puppet, used, praised, then discarded. If she resisted too openly, she'd be labeled rebellious, unholy, dangerous. But she did not come out of a trance to become someone's accessory. So she did what prophets often do when the world tries to tame them. She doubled down on the call. She fasted harder. She prayed longer. She began speaking about spiritual warfare as if it was not a metaphor, but a daily reality. She described visions, armies of angels, white wings beating against darkness, rivers of light, and faces twisting in shadows like masks that hated being seen. People listening could see it with her. That's why they followed. She narrated an invisible world as if it had texture, the smell of smoke, the taste of iron, the cold breath of fear creeping into a room, and the movement kept growing, not just because of miracles, because of meaning. In a Nigeria being reshaped by colonial pressure, urban migration, economic struggle, and cultural collision, Christiana's message offered a storyline. Your suffering isn't random. Your battles aren't just physical. You are not alone, and you are not powerless. That kind of message is addictive and dangerous. Because the more people believed, the more the enemies sharpened their knives, some literal, most social. And somewhere in the city, the humiliated rival who lost his charm bundle began planning his return, not as a loud disruptor, but as something colder. a whisper campaign, a legal complaint, a doctrinal attack, a way to turn the authorities, church and colonial, against a woman who refused to stay in her place. Christiana could feel it coming the way you feel thunder before rain. And as she stared into the night after one long vigil, robe clinging to her skin, she didn't look like a young seamstress anymore. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a war she didn't start, but could no longer avoid. The nights became their real country. In Lagos, daylight belonged to clerks, traders, police whistles, and the hard arithmetic of survival. But after sunset, after the last bus coughed past, after compound gates clanged shut, after mothers pulled children inside, the praying people began to move. Quiet at first, then in clusters. White cloth flashing in lamplight like fish bellies, bare feet whispering over sand. A hymn, starting somewhere far off and drifting closer, like a slow tide. If you followed them, you'd end up at a room that didn't look like a temple, until you stepped inside. A low ceiling, walls sweating with heat, kerosene lamps trembling, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with perfume and fatigue and human breath. And at the front, sometimes standing, sometimes kneeling, Christiana, not dressed like a queen, no jewels, no polished shoes, just white garment, simple and severe, hair covered, face sharp with fasting. She wasn't trying to be pretty. She was trying to be clear. They didn't begin with performance. They began with a sound, almost primitive in its honesty, people exhaling their lives. The first prayers were messy, half sob, half anger. Someone praying for a child, someone praying for food, someone praying to stop drinking, someone praying because they were terrified of what they dreamed last night. Then the rhythm changed. Clapping started, slow, then faster. A chorus rose. The words were Christian, but the electricity was Yoruba. Call and response, the communal insistence that no one suffers alone. People rocked forward and back as if their bodies were oars and the room was a river they had to cross together. And that's when Christiana's gift made itself terrifyingly practical. She would lift her head, and it was like the temperature dropped 2 degrees. Not because the room cooled, but because people's spines stiffened. She didn't have to shout. Often she didn't. Her authority wasn't volume. It was timing. She'd point abruptly at someone in the crowd. "You," she'd say. A man would blink, confused, then slowly stand because everyone was looking at him. He'd start to speak, and she'd cut him off with a sentence that landed like a slap. "Stop beating your wife in secret and praying in public. Heaven is not blind." The room would go silent, then erupt, some in shame, some in triumph, some in fear. The man might deny it, voice shaking. But his wife, usually seated behind him, would start to cry, because denial is easy until a stranger says your private pain out loud. Then Christiana would turn away, like she wasn't interested in humiliation for its own sake. She was interested in diagnosis. "Bring water," she'd order. "Pray." They used water constantly, plain water, prayed over until people believed it carried a charge. Not magic, they insisted. Obedience. But to outsiders it looked like sorcery wearing Christian clothes. A small cup could become a weapon against fever. A basin could become a mirror for confession. A splash could feel like a verdict. Sometimes they used candles, sometimes oil, sometimes a white cloth tied around a wrist. Symbols that made spiritual ideas feel physical. People needed that. They needed their invisible fears to have edges. And Christiana understood the psychological hunger behind ritual the way a seamstress understands fabric. You don't just see it. You feel where it pulls. On certain nights, she would go still mid-song. Her chin would lift. Her eyes would unfocus, as if she was staring at something just over the congregation's heads. Those were the nights the room became dangerous, because then she spoke like someone dictating from another place. She'd describe what she saw with unnerving detail. A face in the crowd wearing kindness like a mask, a shadow following someone home, a rope around a person's waist that represented debt, addiction, a binding promise made in desperation. People who came with skepticism found their skepticism sweating off them. And in that climate, miracles weren't always gentle. Sometimes they were ugly. A woman would walk in barely able to stand, her legs swollen, skin shiny as if stretched too tight. She'd be carried to the front. Christiana would not coo. She would not perform pity. She would tell the woman to confess what she'd been hiding, because in their worldview, sickness was often spiritual warfare with a biography. The woman would confess something like jealousy or bitterness or an abortion nobody knew about or a curse spoken in anger. The crowd would groan, not because confession shocked them, but because it reminded them how thin the wall was between respectable and ruined. Then the prayers would hit like a storm, people shouting, "Jesus!" until the word stopped sounding like a name and started sounding like a hammer. Hands laid on the woman. Water splashed, the woman shaking, vomiting, crying. There are few things more disgusting and more convincing to a crowd than a body expelling something. It looks like evidence. When the woman finally stood, wobbling, the room exploded with relief and fear. Relief, because hope had a witness. Fear, because if this power was real, it could also expose them. That's why people kept coming. Not just the poor. Not just market women. Clerks came. Apprentices came. Mothers with babies came. Men who acted tough outside came and sat quietly in back, trying not to be recognized because their pride couldn't handle being seen needing help. And then, inevitably, rivals came too. At first, the rivalry stayed outside the room. Rival prophets held their own gatherings, trying to outsing, outshout, outperform the white garment people. They told communities, "Those ones are strange. They're mixing things. They're making a girl into an idol." But as Christiana's influence grew, the competitors' strategy changed. If you can't beat a movement with louder prayer, you try to break it with systems. One evening, as worship built toward its peak, a knock hammered the door. Not a polite knock. The kind of knock that says, "We own the building." The singing faltered. People looked around, eyes wide. Someone moved toward the door. Another knock. Harder. Then voices. Authoritative. Clipped. Police. In colonial Lagos, the police weren't just about crime. They were about order. A room full of sweating Africans shouting prayers at midnight looked to certain officials like potential riot. The door opened, and the room filled with the cold smell of wet uniforms and authority. A constable stepped in, eyes scanning. Behind him, another, holding a paper as if paper itself could tame the chaos. "Who is in charge here?" the constable demanded. For a heartbeat, nobody moved, because nobody wanted that responsibility, not when the baton was visible. Then a man near the front shifted, ready to offer a safer answer. Someone older, male, respectable. But before he could speak, Christiana stood. "I am." The room inhaled. The constable looked her up and down, pausing on the white garment like it offended him. He smirked. "You're making disturbance," he said. "Neighbors complain. Too much noise. Too many people. You need permit." Christiana didn't argue theology. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She did something far more subversive. She spoke calmly. "Officer," she said, "your mother prays too. She just does it behind walls so you can pretend it isn't real." A few people gasped, because that was dangerously close to disrespect. The constable's hand tightened on his baton. "Do you want trouble?" Christiana's eyes didn't drop. "Trouble is already here. You didn't bring it. You only came because someone sent you." That's when the twist surfaced. The raid wasn't random. Someone had sent them. Someone had filed complaints, exaggerated noise, hinted at rebellion. Someone wanted official pressure to do what gossip couldn't. The rival had upgraded his war. The constable ordered them to disperse. Some members pleaded quietly. Some bristled. A few, fueled by spiritual adrenaline, looked like they might resist, and Christiana's voice cut through the emotional chaos. "Stop," she said. "No fighting." That command alone prevented blood. Because the room was ready to explode, she turned to the constable. "We will go. Not surrender." Strategy. As people filed out into the night, the police watched with suspicion, expecting violence. Instead, they watched a disciplined stream of white garments moving like a silent procession. It unsettled them more than shouting would have. Noise can be dismissed as disorder. Discipline looks like organization. Organization looks like threat. Outside, under a moon that made everything look slightly unreal, Christiana murmured something to those nearest her. They would not meet here again soon. And just like that, the movement did what persecuted movements always do when they learn survival. It became harder to pin down. Meetings rotated. Prayer nights shifted locations. Small groups met in homes. Messages passed mouth to ear. The more authorities pushed, the more believers interpreted it as proof they were doing something spiritually significant. Nothing recruits like opposition. But opposition also attracts another kind of danger: internal fracture. Because as the group grew, so did the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Who truly leads this fire? Christiana's prophecies increasingly shaped decisions: where to meet, whom to trust, which cases to handle, what boundaries to set. People began to seek her first, before they sought older male leaders. Women especially did. They saw in her not only spiritual power, but permission to exist loudly in a world trained to mute them. And some men could not tolerate that. They didn't attack her gift directly anymore. They attacked her role. They started saying things like, "A woman should not command men. A woman should not rebuke elders. A woman should prophesy only under authority." Authority in their mouths meant one thing: under a man. So the rivalry shifted again, from external competitor to internal tension. The competitor outside was dangerous, yes, but the competitor within was worse, because it wore the face of brotherhood. Christiana felt it. You could hear it in the way prayers started to sound like negotiations. You could see it in the way certain leaders stood slightly apart when she spoke, arms crossed, pretending neutrality while rehearsing resentment. And then one night, another packed vigil, another room sweating with bodies, Christiana delivered a prophecy that detonated the polite surface. She spoke about greed inside the movement, about offerings eaten before they reached the poor, about men who used prayer meetings to pursue women, about leaders who loved applause more than holiness. People shifted uncomfortably because they knew she wasn't speaking into the air. She was naming a hidden rot. After the meeting, in the low chaos of people leaving, a senior figure confronted her. His voice was controlled, but his eyes were furious. "You're tearing down what we're building," he said. Christiana's reply was quiet. "If it can be torn down by truth, it deserves to fall." That sentence, simple, brutal, split the room like lightning. From there, everything accelerated. More people began to identify the movement with Christiana's directness, her uncompromising approach. Others clung to older structures, insisting she was only one voice among many. The movement, once united by shared hunger, now carried competing visions of itself. And that's when the external rival struck again. This time not through police, but through scandal. A rumor began spreading through Lagos like smoke, that the white garment people were doing things at night, sexual things, unholy things, that their vigils were cover for perversion, that their white clothes were camouflage for filth. It was disgusting, and it worked, because disgust spreads faster than nuance. Women began facing harassment. Young men in white were mocked in the street. Landlords refused to rent spaces. Some families dragged their daughters away from meetings by force. Christiana understood the goal immediately: isolate the movement socially so it would starve. So she responded the way a prophetess responds when she can't fight with fists. She staged visibility. Instead of hiding, they marched in daylight. A procession moved through Lagos, white garments bright under sun, singing loud enough to drown out mockery. Children ran alongside. Traders stopped mid-sail to stare. Some people crossed themselves. Some spat. Some followed. Christiana walked near the front, not smiling, not waving, just moving with the calm of someone who had decided she would not be shamed into disappearance. At a junction, a group of young men tried to block them, shouting insults. One grabbed at a woman's robe, trying to rip it and expose her. The woman yelped. The crowd tensed, ready to retaliate. Christiana stopped. She turned and looked at the attacker with a coldness that made him hesitate. "You want to strip us?" she said, voice carrying. "Because you think if you see skin, you win, but you're the one naked inside. Everyone here can smell your fear." The boy's friends laughed nervously, not sure if this was performance or curse. The boy's hand loosened. The robe fell back into place. And then Christiana did something startlingly non-mystical. She instructed the women to hold their cloth tighter and keep walking. No riot, no brawl, no spectacle for the enemy. That discipline, again, made them harder to defeat. But discipline has a cost. It turns a movement into an institution, and institutions generate bureaucracy, disputes, power struggles. People who come for miracles sometimes stay to build kingdoms. Christiana kept focusing on the spiritual work, healing, prophecy, counseling, nights of prayer, guidance for the troubled. She became, in effect, a living court of appeals for the suffering. People came with cases that would make your stomach tighten. A girl saying her uncle touched her at night. A wife saying her husband planned to sell their child to pay debt. A man saying he'd been initiated into something he didn't understand and now feared he'd die if he left. Christiana listened, eyes fierce. Some cases she handled with prayer. Some she handled with blunt advice. Some she handled by sending people away from danger, quietly relocating them like a spiritual underground railroad. And because she was a woman, people told her things they would never tell male leaders. The secrets poured into her until it must have felt like carrying a city inside her ribs. Meanwhile, the rivalry with the outside competitor developed an edge of obsession. He started attending from a distance, lingering at the back of gatherings, trying to catch contradictions. He recruited sympathizers to infiltrate. He collected stories, then twisted them into weapons. One infiltrator tried to get close to Christiana, offering help, offering loyalty, offering resources. He talked like a man who wanted to serve. Christiana let him speak. Then she said casually, "Your tongue is too smooth. You were sent." The man froze. Christiana continued almost kindly, "Tell your master that the net he is weaving will catch his own feet. He should stop before he drags others with him." The infiltrator left the meeting early, sweating despite the cool of night. When he reported back, the rival didn't retreat. He escalated. Again. And this time the attack went for the sharpest nerve, legitimacy. He began spreading the claim that Christiana's prophecies were not from God, but from other powers she refused to renounce. He framed her as a dangerous bridge between Christianity and traditional spiritual systems, an accusation designed to make both sides hate her. Christians fearing pagan contamination, and traditionalists fearing Christian theft. It was clever, nasty, effective. Suddenly, Christiana wasn't just a spiritual leader. She was a controversial symbol in a culture war. And inside the movement, leaders who were already uneasy found a convenient excuse to push back. "We must protect the church's reputation," they said, meaning we must limit the woman. Christiana faced a choice: submit and be contained, or step into open conflict. She chose conflict, not because she craved it, but because the work demanded it. The shift was subtle, but real. She began leading separate gatherings more often, especially with women, with the marginalized, with those dismissed as too messy for formal religion. Her gatherings felt less like an institution and more like a battlefield hospital. People coming in bleeding, leaving bandaged, sometimes shaken, often changed. And it worked. So the crowds kept coming, which, of course, made the rival even more furious. Because the competitor's deepest wound wasn't theological, it was personal. He wanted to be the one people pointed to when they said, prophet. He wanted the stories, the awe, the power of being needed. And Christiana kept taking that away from him. Not by stealing, but by simply being undeniable. The tension rose toward a breaking point that could only end one way. Someone would have to claim the narrative as officially theirs. Someone would have to decide who the true movement belonged to. And in the background of all this, quiet, heavy, another reality pressed in. Christiana was human. Fasting, sleepless nights, constant counseling, spiritual warfare, social attacks. It all wore her down. People close to her noticed moments when her hands trembled, moments when her gaze went distant, not in prophecy, but in exhaustion. Moments when she'd sit alone after a meeting and stare at her palms like they were unfamiliar objects. But even then, she didn't stop. Because for those who followed her, she wasn't just a leader. She was proof that the invisible world could be confronted, and that a woman could stand at the center of that confrontation without apology. That was revolutionary. And revolutions always collect enemies. As the rival prepared his biggest strike yet, one designed not merely to embarrass, but to permanently sever Christiana from the movement. As official identity, Christiana herself began speaking more often about endings, not the ending of the world, the ending of a season, the ending of a certain kind of protection, the ending of innocence. One night she looked out over a crowd so large it spilled into the street, faces lit by lanterns, white garments glowing like bones. And she said, "You think this is only prayer? But it is also a court case, and the verdict is coming." Nobody understood what she meant. Not fully. The verdict didn't come down from heaven with thunder. It came down from a desk with ink stains, a desk with papers stacked like quiet weapons, a desk inside a police station where the air smelled of sweat, old wood, and authority that didn't need to raise its voice. That's what made it so vicious. After all the nights of prayer and visions and bodies shaking under spiritual pressure, the blow that tried to end Christiana's rise arrived as bureaucracy. One morning, word spread through the white garment circle that they wanted a meeting, not a prayer meeting, a settlement, an official discussion to stop the scandal, to calm the city, to protect reputations. Those clean, respectable words people use when they mean you're too loud, you're too powerful, and you're making men look small. Christiana came anyway. She walked toward the station in white, not dressed like someone coming to beg, but like someone coming to testify. The streets stared. In a city where everyone knew everyone's business, her robe was a moving headline. Inside, the station's coolness felt unnatural after Lagos heat. Men in uniform looked her over like she was a strange animal that had wandered into the wrong cage. Some smirked. Some avoided eye contact because they didn't want to be the one who laughed and then got named in prophecy. The conflict that had been simmering between the older leadership structure and the woman whose gift made her impossible to hide finally showed its teeth. Across the room, leaders from the prayer band's inner circle stood in tense clusters. The rival camp was there too, smiling politely the way people smile when they've already decided the outcome. And somewhere in that web of faces was the deepest, most painful truth. The movement's biggest threat wasn't only outside enemies. It was the fear of a woman who refused to be under. A paper was produced. Words were read aloud like a spell. It wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as separation for peace. They wanted to draw a line through the fire and claim the larger half for themselves. Christiana listened without interrupting. Her face didn't change much, but those who knew her noticed the tiny signals. The jaw set, the eyes sharpened, the way she inhaled. Slowly, like someone preparing to dive underwater. When they finished reading, a man behind the desk looked up and asked the question as if it were simple. "Do you agree?" For a moment, the room hung in silence so tight you could feel it on your skin. This was the moment everyone wanted. The moment she would either submit and become safe, or resist and become a problem they could justify crushing. Christiana didn't shout. She didn't quote scripture like a sword. She said one sentence, quiet and lethal. "You can separate names on paper. You cannot separate what God started in the spirit." That made a few men flinch, as if the word spirit belonged to her and they hated it. They pushed the paper forward anyway. Ink. Signature. A stamp that hit the page like a gavel. And just like that, with the dull thud of administration, the prayer fire split into rival flames. To the public, it looked like confusion. To insiders, it was war. In the days that followed, the movement fractured into camps, each claiming purity, each claiming the true origin story, each trying to drag the crowd with it. The rival, who had been stalking them like a hungry dog, saw his chance. He painted the split as proof that Christiana was divisive, rebellious, unclean. He didn't need to win the people's hearts. He only needed to muddy the water enough that her authority looked questionable. But Christiana, instead of collapsing under the weight of scandal, did what she always did when attacked. She built, not with bricks at first, with discipline. She gathered those who still trusted her gift, especially those who had been treated like disposable bodies in other spaces. Women, the poor, the sick, the ashamed. She insisted that prophecy wasn't entertainment, that prayer wasn't a stage, that purity wasn't a costume. And then she did something that changed her from a phenomenon into an institution. She traveled. She moved through western Nigeria like a living rumor turned real, arriving in towns where people had only heard the stories, then letting those towns watch the stories breathe. She held gatherings that weren't only nighttime vigils but daytime crusades, speaking against fear and spiritual intimidation with the confidence of someone who had survived both. In some places, crowds welcomed her like medicine. In others, they watched with narrowed eyes, suspicious of a woman who commanded rooms. And in some places, this is where the story gets ugly, people tried to test her the way men test women they can't control. They challenged her in public. They asked her to name secrets. They tried to bait her into cursing someone, because if they could make her look cruel, they could justify calling her demonic. Christiana rarely took the bait. When she did respond, it was with that same surgical style, exposing motives, not merely facts. "You didn't come for truth," she once told a heckler. "You came for a show, and you're angry because God is not your dancer." Sometimes the crowd laughed. Sometimes they fell quiet, and you could almost hear shame moving through them like wind. But even as her influence spread, the cost of leadership deepened, because now she wasn't only battling outside rivals, she was battling history's favorite weapon against women, erasure. When male leaders wrote their version of the movement's origin, Christiana was reduced to an assistant, a vessel, an incident, a girl who fainted, a girl who was prayed for, a girl whose story helped a man become founder. Christiana understood what they were doing. If you control the origin story, you control legitimacy. If you erase her from the beginning, you can treat her authority as an accident, not a calling. So she fought back, not with fists, but with narrative. She insisted publicly and repeatedly that she was not a footnote in someone else's miracle, that the trance, the vision, the message, the birth of the white garment identity, those were not things she borrowed. They were things that happened through her. And she was done watching men pick the fruit of a tree while calling the tree irrelevant. That insistence made her enemies snarl, but it also made her followers love her harder, because they recognized something in her struggle that went beyond religion. She was fighting the ancient battle of women refusing to disappear. Years passed. The movement, now splintered into multiple branches, continued to grow anyway, because the hunger it fed was bigger than the personalities at the top. People still needed healing, still needed protection, still needed meaning that made them feel less alone in a world of uncertainty. And Christiana matured into the role she had once been forced into overnight. The raw fire of her early years became something steadier, authority that didn't need spectacle. Her meetings became known for order as much as ecstasy. White garments stayed. All-night prayer stayed. But there was also instruction on conduct, on marriage, on community responsibility, on not turning deliverance into a theater of humiliation. She was not naive. She knew spiritual power could easily become spiritual addiction, so she demanded practical outcomes. Reconcile with the person you wronged, return what you stole, stop beating your children, stop using prayer as excuse for laziness, stop hiding cruelty behind holiness. That practicality is one reason people in Nigeria revered her. She didn't just talk about heaven. She dragged faith into kitchens, marketplaces, bedrooms, and back alleys. And then, another twist. Her personal life took a turn that made some critics lose one of their favorite weapons. She married. Not as a surrender, not as a quiet retirement into domesticity, but as a statement that a prophetess could be a public leader and still have a family life without being discredited as loose or uncontrolled. It didn't stop people from gossiping. Nothing stops gossip, but it complicated the cheap stories her enemies tried to sell. Her ministry continued for decades, and her name stopped being the girl who fell into trance and became a title people said with careful respect. Some called her captain, not because she wore a military uniform, but because she commanded spiritual territory like a field officer. Strategic, relentless, unafraid to order a retreat if retreat saved lives. Yet the rivalry never fully died. It evolved. When the original rivals aged, younger leaders inherited their grudges like family heirlooms. By then, the cherubim and seraphim world was a constellation of churches, similar garments, similar prayers, but different banners, different headquarters, different claims about who had the pure line. It was confusing to outsiders and exhausting to insiders, and Christiana, older now, seasoned, watched the splinters multiply and understood a hard truth. A movement can survive persecution, but it can choke on its own divisions. That realization set the stage for the most unexpected turn of her later life. Unification. After years of competing branches, there were attempts, formal and informal, to bring factions together. Some leaders wanted unity because it looked powerful. Some wanted it because it made administrative sense. Some wanted it because they feared history would remember them as the ones who broke the house. And Christiana? She wanted it for a reason that was both spiritual and deeply personal. Recognition. Not ego. Legacy. She had lived long enough to see men rewrite her story too many times. She had seen her name treated like a rumor, while institutions built on her trance collected offerings in her absence. So when unification talks rose again, she came not as a pleading old woman. She came as a witness who refused to die before the record was set straight. In meetings that must have been thick with old resentments, she sat across from leaders who had spent years denying her co-founder status, years minimizing her role, years treating her as the inconvenient woman who wouldn't stay in her place. And now those men, or their successors, wanted unity. Unity is a beautiful word. It is also a negotiation. Christiana demanded that unity without truth was just a bigger lie. That if they wanted one church, they had to stop erasing the woman who carried the vision that birthed the identity. Some resisted. Some were offended. Some tried to compromise with half acknowledgments, praise that sounded sweet but still kept the throne male. But time is a brutal persuader. When elders die, their certainty dies with them. When followers are tired, they stop caring who gets credit and start caring who brings peace. And so, after a long season of struggle, there came a moment that felt impossible in her youth. Christiana was publicly reinstalled, recognized, honored at a national level within that religious world as a central founding figure. Not everyone agreed, not every faction surrendered, but enough did, that the symbolic weight shifted. The woman they tried to shrink into a footnote stood again in full view, not as a scandalous girl, but as a mother of the movement. If you want to understand why she is revered, sit with the emotional violence of that reversal. Imagine spending a lifetime being told you are too much, too loud, too visionary, too female, and then living long enough to watch the story bend back toward you. But even this triumph carried a shadow, because the body keeps receipts, years of fasting, years of sleepless nights, years of carrying other people's secrets and horrors, years of being a target. All of that takes its payment eventually. As she aged, those close to her noticed how the fire had to be rationed. She still prayed, still spoke, still led, but there were moments when she paused longer before standing. Moments when her breathing sounded heavier after meetings. Moments when she sat alone, eyes closed, and the room around her felt like it should whisper instead of talk. The younger ones still wanted endless nights of power. The older ones, those who had watched her bleed reputation and stamina, began to protect her time like a sacred object. And then came the final season, when whispers shifted again, not of scandal this time, but of inevitability. "She's not as strong," people murmured, not with disrespect but with fear, because many couldn't imagine the movement without her living presence. For some, she had become a spiritual landmark, like a big tree in a village. You don't realize how much shade it gave until you imagine it gone. When she finally died, it hit her people in two waves. The first wave was disbelief. Not denial in the childish sense, denial in the spiritual sense. The sense that someone so woven into the invisible world shouldn't be bound by ordinary endings. The second wave was physical reality. The body is a stubborn thing. Even prophets have bodies. Even legends do. The news moved fast, faster than any formal announcement. Across Lagos and beyond, messages traveled mouth to mouth, church to church, compound to compound. The prophetess was gone. And then, in the days around her burial, something happened that revealed what she truly meant to Nigeria. People came, not just her immediate followers. People from other branches, even those who once dismissed her. People who had been healed decades earlier and still carried the memory like a scar of gratitude. Women who said she saved them from abusive marriages. Men who said her rebuke rescued them from self-destruction. Families who said her prayers were the turning point when everything was collapsing. White garments filled the roads like a river of cloth. The air carried that strange blend that always hangs over big funerals. Perfume, dust, sweat, flowers, and grief so thick it feels like weather. Hymns rose in waves. Some mourners wailed openly, the way Yoruba mourning sometimes refuses to be polite. Others stared ahead with dry eyes because shock can freeze tears in the throat. And in that crowd, inevitable, almost poetic, were also the rivals. Not all of them, and not always in the open. But rivalry doesn't always end when a person dies. Sometimes it intensifies, because death turns a leader into a story, and stories can be owned. There were whispered disputes about protocol, about who should speak, about which titles should be used, about which branch could claim her most loudly. Even at the edge of the grave, people were still competing for narrative. But grief has a way of humiliating pride. As the ceremonies unfolded, as the songs continued, as people remembered her bluntness, her compassion, her terrifying accuracy, her refusal to be erased, the crowd's emotional truth began to crush the petty politics. Whatever else you believe about Christiana Abiodun Emmanuel, one thing became undeniable in that season. She had shaped an entire religious culture, not as a quiet helper, as an architect. After her death, her legacy did what powerful legacies always do. It multiplied and became contested. Some groups elevated her as a saint-like figure, retelling the trance story with richer detail each year, painting visions with brighter colors. Angelic visits, heavenly journeys, divine instructions delivered like military orders. Others tried to keep the legacy respectable, sanding down the mystical edges to fit modern sensibilities. They spoke of her as a great leader, but avoided the messier parts, the vomiting healings, the public rebukes, the disgust people felt when confronted with their own hypocrisy. And then there were those who still couldn't forgive her for the most unforgivable thing she did. She proved a woman could lead, spiritually, without asking permission. That is why she is revered in Nigeria, not only because of miracles or prophecies, but because her life became a template. In a society where spiritual authority often translates into social power, she carved out space for women to speak, to command, to correct, to found, to build, to be remembered. Even today, In the way people talk about white garment worship, the night vigils, the water prayers, the disciplined ecstasy, you can feel her fingerprints. The practices aren't merely rituals, they're cultural memory. And the rivalry that once tried to suffocate her story, it accidentally immortalized her, because nothing keeps a figure alive like a fight over their name. If everyone agreed about her, she'd be a paragraph. Because people argued, she became a legend. So when Nigerians honor her, it's not always gentle honor. It's not museum glass reverence. It's living honor, sometimes messy, sometimes political, sometimes deeply emotional. Her memory is invoked in sermons, in anniversaries, in spiritual instruction, in disputes about true heritage. People still use her story to warn arrogant leaders, to encourage exhausted women, to remind young prophets that gifts without discipline become chaos. And if you zoom out far enough, you see the simplest reason she remains folk, and not only official. She belonged to ordinary people. She was not a prophetess who lived behind velvet curtains. She was in cramped rooms, in sweaty crowds, in the unbearable confessions of the poor, in the shaking hands of the sick, in the terror of those who believed invisible forces were eating their lives. She didn't just preach to people. She dealt with them, their bodies, their shame, their secrets, their disgusting human mess. That's why she was both loved and feared. Because she didn't offer spirituality as decoration. She offered it as confrontation. And in the end, that confrontation outlived her lungs, outlived her pulse, outlived the men who tried to stamp her out with paper. A girl left a tailor's shop and became a movement that still walks the streets in white. A girl lay on a mat while flies landed on her face, and she smiled like she had seen something that made ordinary life look small. And a nation, complicated and beautiful, still calls her name when it needs to remember that faith can be both comfort and knife. Comforting the wounded, cutting the lies.